you're going to see about going into Fort Pulaski National Monument. Let's see how this is here, and I'll be able to record a little bit for you guys. Welcome, pay here, credit card only. I made it into the park, and a good thing, Memorial Weekend, veterans come in for free. So we saved 20 bucks. If we look to the right there, I know it's hard to see, the monument's over there. We're gonna stop at the Welcome Center, and then we'll do a quick walk to the there's the fort. This must be the Welcome Center. Visitor Center. We'll take a walk in there, get some information, and then we'll take a walk over here at the fort. Here's the bustling village. We are here, and we're going to end up going out here. If you want to read a little bit about it, just pause the video. Alright, so you're going to do a tour, and a gentleman said that it's fine for me to go ahead and record. So I'm going to be going around with him and some other people and doing the tour. Excuse me.
Volunteer. I'm actually a full-time volunteer at various parks around the world, around Florida and Georgia. I just go from park to park and have the dream job.
Yeah.
Being a volunteer is a sweet spot because you don't have to be responsible to anybody. You don't have paperwork. They treat you like gold, of course. So anyway, Fort Pulaski. Fort Pulaski is named after General Pulaski, who was in the Revolutionary War, not the Civil War. You might see his name on towns and bridges and streets all over the country. He's a hero in the Revolutionary War. He saved George Washington's life. He started the cavalry in the Revolution, so he's pretty significant, but a lot of people don't know what it is. They see the word, they don't know who it is. He's a pretty cool guy. He's buried downtown Savannah in one of the squares here. So he's kind of a local hero. So when they built the fort here, they established that as the name of the fort based on his notoriety and his contribution. Okay? So remember when you came across the bridge on the other side, Route 80, you saw the great big salt marsh over there?
Yeah.
As far as the eye can see, that you couldn't even walk on? This was the same way before they started fixing up the fort. So same deal. There was a few hammocks here where there were raised areas with a few trees on them, but essentially we're just flat going out that way, just like it was that way. Now the thing that they had to do when they decided they wanted a fort here is be able to make it a facility, make the ground enough to be able to build a fort on. Like you'd be standing in muck right now. They sent a guy from West Point, a lieutenant fresh out of West Point who was trained as an engineer to come down and start all the dredging of all of the canals to drain this area. So the whole concept was to build up levees and get drainage out so you could dry it out a little bit to be able to build a fort on it. That lieutenant was Robert E. Lee. He was in the Federal Army at that time. And an interesting anecdote that I found out was his classmates, and during that same period of time, all the generals you heard about in the Civil War, they all knew each other. They weren't like strangers trying to figure out each other. And I'm saying that adds a whole new dimension to the Civil War, because not only did they have to strategize where they would go based on intelligence information and where to put their power and their manpower, they also had to psych out the other guys. So they knew, for instance, General Grant, he ends up being a freaking genius because he could do all of that and put it all together and still be drunk. And so, you know, the old story when Lincoln was told, hey, Grant's, you know, he's drinking all the time, he's always drunk. And Lincoln says, find a case of whatever he's drinking and send them all to our generals and let them have the same stuff. Well, anyway, that's the reason he was so successful in the Union Army, because he could put all the pieces together. But they knew each other. They were smart guys. You know, they went to West Point, extensive training and military stuff, but they socialized. They knew each other. They competed in games and stuff like that. So they knew what one guy was more aggressive and maybe a little less, you know, that kind of psychology. And to me, that adds a whole new dimension to the Civil War. It was like a four-dimensional puzzle they were dealing with all the time. Well, anyway, so what they did is they wanted to start draining this. Now, Lee, he didn't like it. He spent most of his time in Savannah chasing women. But he did get the guys to start working, and they spent a few years doing all of the dredging. Like when you came in the park, you saw some canals and stuff. Like they just refurbished one right just as you started coming in between here and the river. And that was necessary to drain all the water away so they could dry it out. And then they started taking some earth and building it up. So this island right now, the whole island is about 50-60% bigger than it was at that time, because there was a lot of dredging in the Savannah River. They would put all the dredging in here, and that's what raises the level here to a reasonable amount to be able to call it solid enough ground. A little bit more of that later. So come on, let's take a walk. I know I got a bunch of fans. So this triangular thing right here looks a little unusual to most people. That's called a demi-lune. I'm suspecting demi-lune is a French word because all of the great engineering done during the early 1800s especially was done by the French. The French were the quintessential engineers in the world. In fact, they hired a French engineer from France to come over and do some designing and built 42 of these forts up and down the coast and in the Gulf Coast. So, and he did some stuff that was way ahead of its time that was pretty cool, I'll point out in a bit.
So
the demi-lune, when during the time, yes sir.
So that's why all the forts look the same. It was the same French guy, because like Zachary Taylor,
yeah,
all the way up, they all look the same. Like
they all look similar, but you know, they're still based on old Roman principles, you know. But he built in some extra bennies along the way. This was flat during the time of building of the fort and during the Civil War. It was used to put up wooden buildings for barracks, for enlisted people, mess halls, stuff like that. Because not everybody could live in the fort. In fact, only officers lived inside the fort. The other guys were living in barracks out here, sometimes out here. There was a village along here on the other side of the parking lot. You see those big round things? Mm-hmm. Those were essentially what's left over from cisterns of that period. Now remember, there was no fresh water here. There's a salt marsh. There was no way of putting a well in here at that time. So what they do is they would collect water on the tops of the roofs and run them down into channels and fill up the cisterns, and that's how they got their fresh water here. Okay. And there was always some kind of village here from the time it was building to afterward, support staff to be able to while the soldiers were here. So anyway, so that got built up. They built inside there are tunnels and rooms for storage of ammunition, big thick walls. And on top of that, they threw all of this earth to make the mountains on top of it to be more of a protection. They never got used. Mm-hmm. On top of the hills, there'll be a few spots where you see a flat piece of stone ready to hold some cannons and guns. They never got put there. Like most things, you got to remember, when you build a fort, you don't build it during a war. You build it before the war. It's all preventive stuff. Mm-hmm. So a lot of forts, a lot of fortifications everywhere were built but never got used for anything. This is a perfect example of it. Okay, come on, let's go. Any questions so far? Now the moat is actually fed by a channel of water coming off that river. It goes up and down with the tide. Sometimes they close off the gate so the water, I'll walk out here. They close out the gate to prevent the water from going in and out, because sometimes the tide gets so low that it gets too shallow in here. So they built in a gate that when it got full, They closed the gate, trapped the water inside so they wouldn't have to deal with low water. But just outside the gate on that channel over there, you'll see the water get dramatically low. We have very high tides here. We have a 6-foot difference to 10-foot difference in tides here. That's normal. There are fish in there.
Yeah, we see
So
him
as we're
jumping.
walking along, if you hear a splash, that's probably a mullet jumping after a bug. But there are bigger ones in there too.
Yeah.
So if you get a chance and you go in the doorway that's on the sidewalk as we're going in the fort, you can go in there, and it's almost like a path that you can follow to go through the tunneled areas, go up on top across where those gun emplacements are, go back down and again. So there's like a little path that takes you through there. It's kind of fun.
Okay.
But the whole thing is clean because it never had used for anything. It's made out of tabby. You know what tabby is? Like the walls you'll see when we're walking in the fort later. It's made out of a combination of materials, whatever's the area that they're building it. It's making their own concrete out of stuff that's available. The Indians did it. They'd actually take shells, grind them up, cook them to make a compound. They had their local minerals, sands, stuff like that. So everywhere you go, they were making it local out of stuff that was there. So by trial and error, hit and miss, the recipe would change from place to place. There were still mansions in the 1930s built down in Cumberland Island, for instance. The Carnegie family had mansions on. The foundations were all made out of the same kind of stuff. If you look in there, you're going to see shells. These shells were in sediment that was dragged up to be able to use as a base for these bricks or these walls. Some of those shells are millions of years old because they were buried inside, underneath them. They weren't next to oxygen. They couldn't oxidize. They couldn't do anything with them. So you'll see a lot of very, very old shells built into the, like when you see rocks and stuff, you know rocks are old. But these are, living being, they're shells from a million years ago sometimes. Bricks. You see lots of bricks. This fort took, they say, one of the estimates for the number of bricks is like 13.5 million bricks.
Oh.
There's some other construction people that have been here saying it's far more than that, except that's the only documents that they had to prove it. So the Demaloon has its own moat, plus the moat between the fort and the Demaloon. It's all the same water being fed in from the river on this channel. Let's take a look over here. The reason I like to sneak up over here is depending on the tide and so forth, that little wheel right there is the thing that opens and lowers the gate.
Okay.
To restrict the flow of water. So let's take a look. So right now, the reason I'm being quiet, I'll tell you in a sec. Right now the tide is very, very low, and you can see a lot of mud here. See how low it is? But that's still up. But I like to look over here very quietly because sometimes I see fish hanging out.
There's a crab right there.
Oh, turtle.
Yeah.
Or is that a crab?
That's a crab.
Oh, yeah. See, that's the river right down there. So all the water that come and go with the water in the moat comes through here. And you can imagine during a tidal change, it gets pretty exciting. The rush of water coming through.
You have alligators?
Absolutely. Alligators don't necessarily hang out in this because this is brackish water from the river. But in between the levees that were established here will be collections of clean water. Okay? I call it clean water, non-salty water. Okay? That's what alligators like. They don't like this stuff. Like a crocodile will have they have a gland that keeps them being bothered by salt water and salt. So when you go down to the far end of Florida, they have crocs down there. Alligators like fresh water. And so you'll see them hanging out on the bank, sunning themselves on a day like this sometimes, crawling out of that water, getting their bodies warmed up. So they're around here. Once in a while they'll fall in the moat. They don't like that because it's salty water.
Looks like you get a lot of oysters around here too.
Oh yeah,
Oh.
all over the place. But I came down. The reason I was leading to this is I came down here the other day, and there must have been 24 fish this big just hanging out here, waiting for the water to come through.
So is it brackish because the tide comes in and brings salt water in, or is
Right.
it just the river itself is like a...
No, the river's fresh water coming down, but you know, remember the Savannah River is really a saltwater estuary.
Yeah.
Okay, and the effect of the tide goes miles.
Gotcha.
So it's like any river that empties into the ocean. As the tide goes in and out, it changes the salinity depending on how high the tide is and how far up the tide goes. But I think you still have effective saltwater in the water as much as 5 miles up the river.
Gotcha.
Maybe even beyond Savannah. Yeah. Don't jump, Mike. It's as good as it looks. Yeah, exactly. It looks real close. I'm going to go over partway here because remember I mentioned we had one battle here. The battle lasted a day and a half. I'll get into some details on that in a bit. But essentially, the Union forces set up camp over on Tybee Island because they wanted to win the fort back. Contrary to some people's opinion, this is not a Confederate fort. This is a Union fort. It was built as a Union fort, completed in 1847, about 15 years before the Civil War era started, okay? But after they were done in 1847, they promptly left it alone. It was empty. There was only 2 people here. There was one military person and the lighthouse keeper. So the governor of Georgia said, I'm getting ready for the Confederacy. I'd like to have that fort. So he sent the local militia in before it was even seceded from the Union, and ultimately took over, was in the fort for about a year and a half. During that period, they turned in the Confederacy with their seceding. And there's about a couple hundred guys, and they all did a bunch of work here inside the fort to get it ready, including put about 40,000 pounds of black powder over in the far corner in the magazine over there. So they were getting ready. So the Union, they obviously knew something happened here through intelligence and stuff like that. So they decided to bring a bunch of cannons down and set them up on the shoreline of Tybee Island. When you go to Tybee, you go over kind of a hoop bridge there. Just on the other side of it, on the left side, you'll see kind of a beach and a bunch of trees and a little distance, like a block between the road and the beachhead. That whole string, they put up 11 batteries of cannons. Now, the cannon story here is one a lot of people hear about. They had the newest technology in cannons called rifle cannons, okay? Most guns these days are built with rifling inside the barrel, which are grooves. Those grooves tend to make a spiral out of anything that passes through it. Plus, those cannons didn't shoot balls, they shot a thing that looked like a bullet that was big. It was pointed on the front, it was designed to catch those grooves and start doing a spin, so when it leaves that barrel, it's spinning like a football, as opposed to a sphere coming out of what they call a mortar cannon. The mortar cannons, they were pretty respectable. They would go about a mile, so they're pretty heavy duty. But the rifled cannons would go up to 5 miles. More accurate and more powerful. They had brand new rifled cannons over there. Now, rifled cannons were absolutely new. They've been around for decades, except a lot of the people, like old timers, they don't want to deal with the newfangled stuff, The Confederacy only had smooth barrel cannons that could go about a mile over to that beachhead, so they were not that effective. They had some rifled cannons, but they were pointed in the wrong direction. They were pointed toward the ocean and the river, and these guys were over here. So for a day and a half, for the first full day, thousands of bombs were exploding over the... You can see this is damage from it. Whenever you see damage up there, that was caused from that battle. All right? The rest of the fort is in very pristine condition that never got beat up and repurposed or used for anything. You're looking at the most preserved fort in the system. So when you go in there, you're looking at the real deal. So as you see over here, you see these craters in the side of this wall. There's more on that other wall that way. So afterward, if you want to take a walk, go around on the grass over on that side, and you'll see more of them. But some of the craters even have cannonballs and shells in them. The far corner had great big holes blasted in from these rifled cannon shells. Those holes were patched up about 6 weeks after that battle. So when you go over there, you won't see any holes on the far corner because that was fixed. But fortunately they left these here so we could be excited and looking at it. Pretty dramatic. So you see many photos of the fort in different places. You'll see the wall with the craters in it. That's what they're doing there. But around the top of the fort, like here and on other parts, you'll see some crunches. Those crunches from the battle. Same deal. At the time that they were using the fort, all the trees you might see all in this area were not here. It was flat like that, and they purposely kept it that way because they wanted to see that south branch of the river over here. Because at the time there was no bridge, and so craft would go up and down there. On the other the north branch of the river is the one that now you see the big container ships going up and down to Savannah. Savannah's still like the third busiest port in the country. What was that? And they're planning on making it bigger. They got a tall bridge that they want to raise. They want to dig more dredging to make bigger ships come in. But right now, the statistic really impressed me was every single day they either take off or put on 13,000 containers a day. And a ship usually doesn't hang here any more than 24 hours. So they got a bunch of berths that designed to bing, bing, bing. They're putting those things in and out of here. And it's still that way. This port isn't like down in Baltimore where you saw the recent crunch. Down in Baltimore is primarily an automobile import. This is mainly containers. So most of your Amazon stuff probably comes in here and in those big containers. So if you haven't seen it yet, to look on the river to see one of those big things coming by with pile high with the containers, it's pretty impressive. So like I said, this area is like, you can see how it's elevated here, and it'll go down. There will be another levee there, and then there was other levees. So if you look at a map, you'll see a series of levees. The fresher waters in between those levees is collections or groundwater, not brackish water. So the saltwater critters like to hang out in that area, like the gators. Once in a while, a gator will fall on the moat. And if it's high tide, it'll come close enough to the edge that he'll be able to crawl out again. But if it's down, they just have to go hauling out. Just the other day, there was a deer that fell in here. It was a fawn, big baby. So we all cried for a while on that one, because that one died. So anyway, so here you get the idea with these holes here. Each one of those is for a cannon. A mullet jump. Each one of those is for a cannon. The slit holes were for smaller artillery like guns, rifles. They were never used. There was never any other battle other than that one here at this fort. The fort was occupied during the Civil War. There was a few hundred guys here. They used it as a place to hold soldiers. They used one of the walls as a prison, so they held lots of Confederate officers in prison here during the Civil War. When the Civil War was over, everybody left. It was abandoned again. 2 people. For decades and decades and decades. 2 people. Then in 1920s, the President of the United States declared this a national monument, national park. And right after that, they sent in the CCCs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that made a lot of the parks all over the country. Millions of guys out there getting jobs, just fixing up stuff, just so they could eat and send money back to their families. They came here. Now, if you can imagine, decades of overgrowth. The moat was full of muck and trees. The inside of the fort was trees growing and weeds and stuff like that. Can you imagine guys walking in? Oh man, what are we going to do here? We got all this. We got a fort we got to make, and all we see is this rubble. Well, they started pulling this stuff aside, and it was here. It was all here. All they had to do is clean up around it, do some rebuilding of some of the wooden structures inside of it. But the point was, everything was sitting here. It wasn't like they had to go recreate anything. So you can imagine, it's like finding a diamond in the rough, And that's the way this place has been maintained in that fashion ever since. This park this year is 100 years old. So in 1923, 1924, that's when they officially opened it up as a park. Another thought was really, because I'm a volunteer and I'm yakking at you guys, but while they were doing the fix up here, they actually designated some of these guys, tour guides, as they were fixing it up. So they were even doing my kind of work back then. And as things unfolded, new stories came out. Because this didn't have a lot of battle, it doesn't mean there wasn't some backstories. So as you're walking around inside the fort, you'll see signage of different stories that are kind of interesting. So there's lots of interesting little anecdotes that may not be related to battle, but the way of life, why they did things in a certain fashion. So it's kind of fun to explore that way. Every day I learn another new fact of some sort about this place. You know, I just absorb it. Because I'm not a professional historian. But I've been around here long enough. I've taken an interest in it. I listen to the other ranger talks, do a little bit of reading, and you just find out these neat stuff that's going on around this place. I'll get into a couple of them. We'll go in the fort now. We'll take a look around.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like cabbage.
So fast.
Every place you go, it not only was a recipe for that area, but that location, that era, whatever was available.
Yeah, it's so awesome.
I was down on Cumberland Island, right on the Georgia, Florida. It's a national park. Take a boat out to it. Like I mentioned, but you go there for the day. And the rain doing tabby here too, you know, further north. And into it about through Arab location on the stuff that would last a long time, because it's made out of that stuff. But you see if it fun that okay, this bridge with lots of other people wonder how the world on the wrong. Well, it's now pivot point is right up, come up. Oh, that's kind of the chain. Here the chain. Close it again. Open it. Do what it's replicate. This is tabby, guys. You see the shells in there? Because remember, before they were this in water and got an old current going. Remember, it goes down hundreds of feet. So it
Because underwater, but not under right.
salt marsh.
Uh-huh.
To put nation for so here's the doorway to go into the Demaloon channels in there. If you walk in there, you'll see rooms. Some of them were for storage. There's nothing in there, but you walk into a certain area and it's made so the light would come on so you can see it. But you take that path all around here. It's kind of fun. But it was never used for anything. It was made out of tabby. You can see it when you look up and around in there. And never used. Okay, so they got the dredging and stuff, or the channels to take the water, displace the water out of the wells. Okay, but come on, it's still a salt marsh. It's not like I'm going to find a desert down there. Okay, so they piled more stuff up, and they started to dig the foundation. Now, there is a basement in the fort. It's not just resting on the ground. There's another 10 feet of open space underneath the flooring down to the base of the basement. So when they started digging the moat in the basement, they did it at the same time. So not only do they do this moat, but the distance from this wall into where you see that far wall is, that's got a basement under it. So that's what they were digging. All done by hand, all done by slaves. Interesting story. The slaves were working here. They were rented from the landowners. The landowners of Georgia would rent his slaves out to work here, he would get all the money.
Was the basement, was that for the magazine or was that somewhere else in the fort?
What?
Where they stick gunpowder, the what stored? Was that, did they keep that in the basement?
No, no, I'll show you in a second.
Okay.
Good morning.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm sure they had it for a purpose, yeah. So I guess they just dug the whole thing out.
So this gate would go up. Now there's a counterbalance system to be able to counterbalance of lifting that weight. It's inside the walls, which you'll be able to see when you go into the rooms here. You go into this room to the left, it was the guardhouse room where the guys slept that were on duty, on and off, that maintained the gate in the front. The sally port is what this is called. And in there you'll see big balls on chains. So all they had, I'm sure it took some work, but I'm saying they had to unloosen it, it's like an elevator. They had a counterbalance to be able to move it. So this gate would get lifted up. This cage would come down. These doors would swing closed. Remember, this is the only way in and the only way out. So they had to secure this pretty good. There were guys in the guard room on either side that maintained this. You see the slots here? They would also close those doors at the top of the hill here. So in effect, they could trap people. If they got past all of this, they still could trap people inside this area and be able to shoot them from these side ports. These doors are original doors on the fort. All of them. So like I said, the foundation of the fort goes from this wall all the way to where the doors are, plus the moat on the outside. And they started digging down, and they thought they're going to make it, find a way of being able to put a foundation. No, more muck. So what they ended up doing is they pounded pilings into that muck at that point. There were 5,200 pilings this far around, going around the whole fort, and there's a table of wood put on top of the pilings, and then another table up in layers. Then they started doing the brick. That brick is the base of the basement. They started building up that table, and then they started building the walls outside of that. So if you walk down to the end of this walkway here, if you walk down at the end of that wallway, behind that brick wall over there, you can go back into that far corner of the fort. There they have the floorboards up so you can see what the basement looks like. So you can see that they got the columns coming down. See how they have the arches, the columns going down? Once in the basement, it's kind of interesting because once you get down at the bottom, they have reverse arches underneath. So think in terms of energy or an impact. An impact is the top, energy is dispersed over the arches like the old Roman days, that was the design. It would go down in the floor, down into the basement through the columns, but then they redistributed the energy because, listen, you're talking about a bunch of wood pilings, you're talking about brick and stuff down there. It wasn't like they were on bedrock. This fort is not sitting on bedrock. It's sitting on those pilings, being held down in the mud. They've gone down there and tested the pilings, same ones are there. Well, that seems kind of flimsy, doesn't it? What happens here, something happens. So a few years ago, they went around with levels on the top of the fort just to see how level it was. Back then, they used levels. It was called a water level. It'd be, when you have a clear tube of water or tube of plastic, you put water in it, you go like this, but the water always stays the same. That's used for level. They didn't have bubble. That's what they would do. So they find a certain point, measure from the ground up to a certain point, and then as they move around, that would always be the level. Same distance. They went around with the real modern level. The whole place is level except for that corner over there. That corner is down 3/8 of an inch. So you're talking about all that time, there's not a crack in the building, there isn't a rip in the building, it's all sitting here like a big hunk right here. 13 million bricks plus, all together. Now the bricks here, you'll see they're kind of a grayish brick. That was brick that was made locally. It's called Savannah brick. In fact, the Savannah brick is good for building something with it, but not necessarily good for forming stuff. It would crumble. You start to, you know how you watch bricklayers, they would knock pieces off to fit. Well, Savannah brick wasn't good at that. That would fall apart. So they imported brick from Pennsylvania and New England. It was more substantial, made for that sort of thing. So you'll see a different color brick in areas where there was more finite fitting to be done, like over the top of the arches and so forth. Another interesting part of this is the fort itself is one structure. The exterior, like you saw where the punches were, that actually wasn't the fort itself per se. It was what they call a scarp. A scarp is an extra layer of brick. It's a big layer of sacrificial brick. It's not connected to the fort, it's right up against it. So in other words, just like in that battle, if that got all blasted away, the structure of the fort held true. And even though they had huge gaping holes over in that corner, the fort wasn't affected. There wasn't a crack in it. So when they put the bricks back in that scarp, easy, build it back up again. But I thought, that's something I found out a few weeks ago, that it's just purely for sacrifice, but it's a bunch of bricks on the outside that are made to be easily replaced. But in essence, that battle, with all the bombing and all the stuff that was going on, did not affect the integrity of the structure. In 1847, this thing was built. Okay, so like I said, the floorboards over there, you can look in there. That magazine that we were talking about that held the 40,000 pounds of black powder, that's down in that corner. So when you're walking around, walk down in the corner, you'll see a plaque on the wall. You can walk in that magazine. It's like a tunnel. It's very tight, very heavily fortified. So what ended the battle? After the first day, all battles, you can imagine thousands of things going off here, bang, the noise must have been incredible. They punched a hole in that corner over there. There was 2 holes in that corner. But once they had the holes open, they could see through the parade ground over to that corner. Now remember who built the fort? Those guys did. That was a Union fort, so they had the blueprints. They knew exactly what they were looking at. So they crossed here. That's where the magazine is. So they stopped for overnight. They started up in the morning, bang, bang, bang. In the middle of the day, 2 rounds exploded right where that little platform of brick is outside. Great big crater in the floor. And the guys that were in here, there was a colonel in charge, a Confederate colonel in charge. So when that happened, after they cleaned out their shorts, they brought out the white flag, raised it up, the flag that was above here to surrender. That was it. So it was a day and a half battle. They won the fort back. They came over, took over the fort, the room down at the end of this group here. This is called a gorge, so this was all more like support. Officers' quarters, nests, stuff like that. That was all the battle stations that were built. They're called casemates. So down in that room, you can see it's marked off as a place where the surrender happened. That sword that you saw in the visitor center that was on display was the sword that the colonel turned over to the general in surrender. Interesting story, that sword was held by the general for a couple of days, and as it was in those days, even enemy officers had respect for each other as long as they behaved themselves, didn't do anything stupid. The colonel here did do that. He gave up and surrendered because he didn't want to. This would have been just a big hole in the ground. All the guys would have been dead, so he gave up. He couldn't have retreated. There was no place to go. There was no bridge. Too many guys. So he surrendered. The general of the Union came in, and a few days later he gave the sword back and said, "You behaved in an honorable fashion." The colonel in here says, "I hope that I didn't disgrace this sword," and he took his sword back. It's an honorary thing. Badge of honor for everybody. So then the general here, he issued a general order. Remember, there was a bunch of slaves here in support of everybody. The general issued an order freeing all the slaves on the island. This little island in the middle of the Confederacy, South Carolina seceded, Georgia seceded, everybody around here, that's all slaveholding. And this little island was an island of freedom for all of these slaves. It became, the word spread like crazy. All of a sudden, people were showing up, swimming across the river, getting in it any way they could. Because once they were here, they were safe. They had the military. A few months later, Lincoln got wind of that. He rescinded the order and wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. So stop and think. That general took it upon himself to do a major change of policy in this country on his own with no approvals from anybody. And I like to think that Lincoln maybe it's just a little bit embarrassed himself. Moving along.
So he rescinded the order and then wrote it
He
back?
rescinded the order and wrote the Emancipation Proclamation.
Their seasons after that, which makes sense.
So so all the soldiers that here held up during the Civil War, it was always occupied. Over there, you'll see bars on the doors and the windows. That's where the prison was. There was 600 Confederate officers held in. They would come and go. You've heard that. You may have seen the sign out on the highway, the Immortal 600. That's where they are. That's not Union officers, Confederate officers. It's still have retained that distinction wherever they are. So after that point in time, while those officers were here, they got dispersed to other places. But the core guys were kept here, and it was rough. This place had the reputation for having a little bit better treatment of its prisoners until other generals got wind of it and told them you ever work for them. But they still had a rough time. You look over there too, you can see bunk beds there. Those bunk beds are king size beds, pretty cool, huh? Well, it was 4 guys to a bed.
Wow.
And no mattress. And those were the lucky guys. So as you're walking around here, there's a little anecdote. Over there behind, that's a fig tree over there, planted by the people that were gardening here. It's the oldest fig tree in the country. You come here in August, you can pick figs and eat them. That's a pecan tree. That was part of the gardening that the people did here. Because while the lighthouse keepers' families were here, they used this as a farm. It was used for a farm. They had livestock out here. They planted these trees. And these are left over from that period. They say that nearly half of the fig trees and gardens in Savannah are cuttings off of this tree. This is Grandpa. They're all descendants of this tree. Another anecdote over there, you'll see in a plaque, you'll see a picture of guys playing baseball. Actually, one of the first pictures of baseball being played back during the Civil War was in this fort. And you'll see the guys on the field there. As it states on the plaque, baseball was basically from New England, right? It was a popular, known sport, but not down in the South. But remember, we were mixing guys here from all over the country. So they started using this fort as a baseball field. You see a picture of the first picture taken of baseball being played during the Civil War. It's things like that you bump into along the way. You know? So when you're here, you can go, each one of the corners is a stairwell. You can walk up, walk around the top. If you go on the top over there, you'll see a diagram of the battle. You'll see the trajectory of the artillery coming in. You're standing in the spot that they were aiming at, and you can see Tybee Island's beachhead where all the cannons are. So it gives you a real life perspective without just being a picture. But you can see the shoreline. There's nothing there except the beach. But it gives you perspective, and that's a mile away. And other batteries along there got up to about 1.25 miles. Like again, the cannons that they used here were not very effective because they were smoothbore cannons. The rifled cannons, I think this was the first battle that they ever used rifle cannons from land to land. Before that, the rifle cannons were primarily used on ships. So this was kind of a new experiment. The moment that the corner of that wall broke down and reached, rendered all of these kinds of forts obsolete. They never built any more of them again. Because now they had technology caught up with them.
Did they have barges to move all the men and
Right.
whatever stuff?
On your parking lot, you'll see a sidewalk going into the woods. If you walk all the way through there, there is the remains of a wharf, not much, a few stones. And there was a town all along that sidewalk. And in that area, there was a big wharf that went out into the river. All the boats would come in. It looked like a busy seaport thing because they could put big ships on either side of it. I understand that they had a narrow gauge railroad to carry materials over there into this, to carry the materials in. I've never seen any evidence so far of any animals being used. No mules, no horses. They must have. It's just I haven't seen, I've looked all over the place, I haven't seen any picture of a horse in the whole place. That means they were pushed by slaves. One final note. The slaves that were freed here, they started to escape. They started to sneak out. You know where they went? The Underground Railroad. Essentially, this was rallying point just prior to the Underground Railroad starting to gel, to do that. So this is pretty significant in terms of that era and what was going on. And then they wouldn't just go north. They would go every direction that they thought they could sneak out to. There were people that stayed here for a long time because when they got hired here by the government to work, they got paid. That freaked them out. They didn't think that ever happened before. But they were getting paid for the stuff, for the work that they did. Okay, any questions?
This is a chapel. Freeze the screen, you can read it. Each room here has its story. I'm not talking, I just want you to see and read for yourself. These are actual craters of when the war. They say they shot from that end, flew out this end. take a walk out here to this other section that got damaged. Those are prison cells. The American flag. Damage to the fort. This is where the federal siege battery occurred. As you can see here, it's that one right there. Where were they shooting? Out there. We're out there. Now we'll start descending, and this video will be over. I was thinking of maybe going all throughout Florida and finding forts and doing videos of all the forts. Tell me in the comments what you think about that idea. If I can get a lot of people agreeing, maybe that's what I will start doing. So you can let me know. These were the jails. Now let me see if we can go in this way, because there's a gate in the front. Oh, yeah, you can go in this way. This is where they house prisoners at. As you can see, it has bars. And of course, these were the officers. And it was 4 to a bed. So, yes, they were big, but it wasn't for one person. And here you can read about the Confederate prisoners of war.